We did. So, of course, he was absolutely ecstatic when he found this out, and then we said, you know, read us the codes, and they hit it 100%. Why am I telling you this? Because he puts together a paper to give at the International Conference on Retrovirology at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, December 1982. So in December 1982, Montagnier goes to New York to give a paper at Gallo's big convention of all retrovirology people. And being the way Gallo is, since Montagnier had no relationship with him and was not a student or a friend, he put him last on the program. And all the previous papers were about other retroviruses or how Gallo's virus was in AIDS patients 1% of the time. And they could never get more than 1%. They were convinced that you get HTLV1 and then you use drugs and it destroys your immune system. But they never got more than 1% of the GRID patients being positive for HTLV1. And he was getting very frustrated. He was convinced it was his virus that causes the disease. So when Montagnier gets up and gives this speech about LAV, the entire room goes suddenly silent. Everyone's in complete shock. And Gallo goes to the microphone and reams them a new one. Are you crazy? Are you insane? I discovered human retrovirology. Do you think the best laboratory in the world, with the best equipment, with the most smart people in the whole world, would miss a human retrovirus? My lab. First of all, Barry Sinusay, who was one of my students, was a C student. She's not smart. That lab you have over in Paris is a piece of crap. It's full of contaminants. This is an environmental contaminant you have misidentified. You're idiots. I could not have missed it. I am the greatest retrovirologist on earth. I would not have missed it. And of course, you know how the French and Americans are. You know, they were the first people to come in our revolution and help us, yet how well do we get along with the French? Not well at all. You know why? Why do we not get along with the French well? We're just alike. We both are arrogant people who think we have the answer for the rest of all of the world. We know the way to do it. And if you do it our way, it'll be fine. Well, that's what they think. And so we have never, you know, it's like two kids with the same personality. They do not get along. So when Gallo is reaming Montagnier, Montagnier tells him, shove it. And he storms off the stage and he says, I withdraw my paper. And he storms out the hall, and just before he leaves the room, Gallo goes back to the podium and says, stop! We can't act like children. This is a world crisis. We have to work together. I don't believe you have discovered anything. However, you have some evidence that needs to be checked out. I will send my very best student with you back to Paris to clean up that nasty hellhole of a lab you've got with all the contamination. And I will have them check your procedures, which I know are false. And you leave your virus and your photograph of it here, and I'll take it to my lab and we'll check it out. However, I know it's crap. However, you could have something. And so we will work together, and every Friday we'll have a conference call and update each other on their research. And Montagnier thought, oh, this is wonderful. The greatest retrovirologist on earth is going to confirm my discovery. And so he does it. And he waits. No Friday calls ever come in. Nothing comes in. So back at the CDC, we are running ELISAs on all 3,000 bloods, and they're coming out 98% positive. So we then run another test that is even better than ELISA, called radioimmune precipitation test, where you radioactively label the virus. So when the antibody sticks to it and you wash it off, you can read it with radioactivity. And it comes out 99.8% positive to LAB. And we are putting together this omnibus paper to submit to the journals. When we get a telephone call, turn on the television. There's about to be an announcement from Washington. Turn on the television, and there it comes on. I'll never forget it. We interrupt As the World Turns to bring you the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler. Now, Margaret Heckler, she's a nice lady, but she's dumb. She's a real estate agent. She was Secretary of Health and Human Services because she donated a lot of money to Ronald Reagan, and they needed a woman in the cabinet. So he made her Secretary of Health. She knew nothing about science. So she comes on and she says, the eminent Dr. Gallo, who at the National Cancer Institute, who was the discoverer of the first human cancer virus, announced today he has discovered the causative agent of GRID. And I don't understand everything he's about to say, so I'm going to have Dr. Gallo present this to you. So Gallo comes up and he says, I've discovered a novel new human retrovirus in the same family as my other two. You do remember I discovered the very first two, not one, two human retroviruses. And I've named my new one after my other two. And I've named it HTLD3, which you'll see on the thing back there. By the way, it doesn't, the letters are the same, but it doesn't stand for lymphotropic, it stands for lymphocytic, which means killing. It's human lymphocytic virus type 3. And he said, it's in the same family as my previous discoveries, and I isolated from people with symptoms of this, and that it is another scientist at the Centers for Disease Control by the name of Paul Fiorino has, by tracing baby GRID, babies that have GRID, has proven that this is in the nation's blood supply. So we are in critical shape because this disease is now in the blood supply. And I will be spending every moment of every day to develop a blood test. And then I will have a blood test in 6 months, and I'll have a vaccine in a year. Thank you. My name is Robert Gallo. And so, remember, he had mentioned that Fiorino, which now is known as the father of baby AIDS, because we changed the name of the disease to AIDS, Paul Fiorino had been looking at babies that had symptoms of GRID, and he had discovered that one of them had received a blood donation from a guy who had died of GRID. And so he was trying to trace all of them, but the Red Cross said no. He went to the Red Cross and said, these babies are dying of GRID. Who gave them the blood transfusions? Where did they come from? And the Red Cross said, privacy. And the guy, and Fiorino says, you realize the entire United States is in danger if you don't allow me to prove this. And they said, and if you do, we won't get free donations of blood. So no, we're not telling you. If it hadn't been for a technician in the Red Cross who went in there and took a floppy, remember those? And copied all the names of the donors and gave it to the government, we wouldn't know. So anyway, Fiorino proved that it was already in the blood supply, and Gallo announced that he was going to have a blood test. Well, the French were going, huh? Don't you guys at the CDC have all these bloods proving that it's LAB? And Gallo didn't mention LAB or anything. And so Montagnier calls Don Francis and he says, Don, do you think that Gallo stole our virus? And Francis says, absolutely not. Maybe he isolated something similar from other people. And Montagnier said, well, you know, the only way to prove that is to get a sample of this virus and run the genetics. Because if I had this disease and I had sex with her and gave it to her, it would change by 5%. But if we took 2 samples from the same person, it would not. It would be almost identical. So they called up Gallo and said, Don Francis says, could you send me a sample of your virus? And Gallo said, are you crazy? I'm trying to save the world. Didn't you hear me on television? Every smidgen of it's got to be used to find the blood test to save the world. Quit bothering me with your petty little problems. And he hung up on him. So Don Francis called the Surgeon General of the United States, C. Everett Koop. Now, the Surgeon General is called the Surgeon General, but he's the general of nothing. He is a spokesman for the American government on health issues. He is given a uniform of a Navy general, but he has no guns or no troops. The only person he can order around is his secretary. But he does have a lot of prestige because, you know, that's his job, to speak for the American government on health issues and to recommend things to the American people. And so Francis calls Koop and says, Gallo, just like little children, Gallo won't give us the virus. And Koop says, yes, he will. And Don Francis says, no, he won't. And Koop says, call me back tomorrow, because he will. So Koop calls Gallo and says, give Don Francis the virus, because you're not going to be able to prove that your virus causes this disease, because you need 3,000 bloods, and the only place in the world where they have them is the CDC. So if you want to prove that this virus causes that disease, you're going to need his bloods and his cooperation, which means you're going to have to give him the virus. And Gallo said, no. And Koop says, yes. Gallo said, make me. You don't control my money. And Koop says, yes, but I can call a press conference and say one head of a laboratory in the United States is failing to cooperate with another and is endangering the American people. So I would like for you to have it to Dr. Francis by next week. Gallo hangs up on him. So we wait. 2 weeks later, we get a styrofoam container with dry ice, and inside it is nothing. So we call up Gallo and say, you sent it, but you didn't send the virus in it. So we wait 2 more weeks, and we get a dry ice container, and inside it is the virus, but no dry ice. So it's disintegrated. So we call him up, and he says, those idiots in shipping, I'll get another one out. So 2 weeks after that, we receive a dry ice container, styrofoam thing. Dry ice is inside it, and then there's a little bullet of HIV-1, which we've had for like 10 years by now. So, Don Francis calls my boss, Jane Getchell. You'll see her. She's the ugliest woman on earth. She's 6'4". Barely got 1 ounce of fat on her whole body. It looks like this. She's my very best friend, but don't tell her I told you how ugly she was. But you can verify it by looking at her right there. She's useless. She was the boss of the production laboratory where I was producing LAV at the time. And he calls her up and he says, Jane, come down here and bring your Gucci purse. You see, in those days, we shipped live deadly viruses on airplanes. We labeled them biological samples, botanical samples, plant samples. We didn't put deadly virus may kill everyone on Earth, because pilots see the manifest of the cargo and they can reject anything they want. So we don't put deadly virus, we put plant samples. But if we want to trace custody, legal custody, you have to send a person. So he sent Jane Getchell with a Gucci purse that's built around a small dry ice container. And she goes to Maryland, and she walks into Gallo's office, and he says, who are you? And she said, Dr. Jane Getchell, MD, PhD, DRPH, 3 doctorates.
Wow.
And he said, so what? And she said, I'm here from the CDC to get HTLV3, which you can't seem to ship with your doctorate. And he slaps down a 20-page legal agreement and says, you don't get it till you sign this. And it says, by signing this and accepting this virus, I do acknowledge the sole and only discoverer of this virus is Dr. Robert Gallo, that I will not do anything with this virus without the prior written permission of Dr. Robert Gallo. Under no circumstances will I look at the genetics of this virus without written permission of Dr. Robert Gallo, that any discoveries made that bring profits will belong to Dr. Robert Gallo, and any paper written, their first author, will be Dr. Robert Gallo. And she says, I can't sign this. It means you give it to me, but I can't do anything without your permission. He said, don't sign it, don't get it. So she calls up Don Francis, and I'm sitting there, and this is the reason I told you she's so ugly. Because he says, Jane, he just cuts her right off. He says, Jane, listen to me, real careful. Don't come back to Atlanta unless you come back with that virus. I don't care what you have to do to Dr. Gallo to get it. You get that virus, and you get back here tomorrow. And if you don't get the virus, don't come back. You won't have a job.
Oh.
So she comes back in the next day, and she has 7 samples. And I'm sitting there wondering, what in the world are they going to do? And so she walks in, she says, I've got 7 samples done, blah, blah, blah. And so Don Francis said, Don Hicks, take 2, get upstairs. I want you to make as much of that as possible. Ramp up the production for it. He says to Jane, take 3 and log them in downstairs in the virus repository, where we can prove legal custody of every step from Gallo to us, because there's going to be a lawsuit. And then he says, take the last sample and give it to Srini Basan. Srini, get in there, and I want you to do the genetics and compare it to LAB. So Jane goes, Don, you can't do that. I signed an agreement we would not look at the genetics of this. And he said, Jane, how does the U.S. government sue the U.S. government? You can't sue yourself. One laboratory suing the other can't. So they did it, and at the first international conference on AIDS, Don Francis made an enemy for life, which you will also see on the video. Gallo still calls him up in the middle of the night every once in a while and says, if it's the last thing I ever do, I will destroy you. Yeah, it's a complete psycho. Anyway, Don Francis gives this big presentation. On one side he has a diagram of the genome of LAB. On the other one he has HTLV3. And at the end of it, he says, in summary, they are 98.98% the same. And the press is out there and they go, we don't understand. What are you saying? Are you saying Gallo stole it? He says, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying these 2 samples came from the same person. And the French can say, there's Bruce, he's still alive. Go get it again if you want to. They say they got it from him and he's still alive. And he's never been to the United States. So why don't you ask Mr. Gallo where he got his? So they went and asked him, and Gallo said he got his blood from 13 anonymous gay men in New York City that donated blood. He mixed it all together and threw it on white blood cells, and out popped HTLV3. Funny, all his guys were anonymous. And when do you take 13 variables and mix them together? No one does that. So, anyway, that was a big controversy, and the reason I bring it up is because to this day, the French and the Americans are still at war over this. And when the Americans give a talk on HIV/AIDS, the French heckle and throw things and walk out, and the same thing happens when the Americans give it, the opposite. And they estimate now that 30% of all the money spent on AIDS research has been wasted because they're duplicating each other's experiments, because neither one will tell the other one what they're doing.
Wow.
So like $28 million was wasted just because each one of them paid for sequencing the same thing. So here's the really strange thing. The Chicago Tribune wanted to find out, did Gallo really steal it? So they did a Freedom of Information Act, remember it's a government agency, on Gallo's lab. And they got his lab record book, and they got the first draft of the paper, because he puts out a paper in Science. And when the paper from Science is published, Montagnier gets it, and he knows he's been robbed. You know why? Gallo didn't have the decency to take another picture. He used the exact same micrograph that Montagnier left with him for his paper. And Montagnier says, how come you use my picture on your paper if you say you got yours separately? And Gallo says, oh, it was just a mistaken publish. So, when the Chicago Tribune does the Freedom of Information Act, they get the first draft of the paper. Now, none of these big deal scientists ever write their own paper, nor do they ever do their own research. They always have a technician. And Gallo's technician is Popovich. And so Popovich, who's a Russian, by the way, had written the first draft of the paper submitted to Science. And the first sentence of the paper says, we gratefully acknowledge the initiating culture kindly donated by Luc Montagnier and designated LAV of the Institut Pasteur. And Gallo had marked it out in red pen and wrote above it, are you crazy, Popovich? This is worth millions. Leave this out. So, why don't you see that in the history books? And the reason is this. When the French discovered LAV and they thought they'd been robbed, they immediately went to the U.S. Patent Office and tried to patent LAV in a blood test, and it was rejected. 2 weeks later, Gallo went to patent HTLV-3 blood test, and it was accepted. So, every blood test in the world that's been run, and you know billions have been run, $1 of profit goes to Gallo and the NCI, National Cancer Institute. 25 cents of that is to Gallo himself personally. When the French went to complain to Reagan, Reagan said, finders, keepers, losers, weepers. So they waited, and when Bush the Smarter became president, they went to complain again. They tried to sue in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now usually the Supreme Court just refuses cases and doesn't say anything. This time they refused with comment. We cannot hear this case because we have no jurisdiction over France. However, all the evidence presented to us shows an intentional misappropriation by agents of the U.S. government. They tried to sue in the French Supreme Court, same thing. There is no place where you can sue one other country. You can't sue in the United Nations. The World Court only handles genocide and trade disputes. So, here's what Bush the Smarter did. Bush the Smarter said to the French, we will give you 25% of the profits, and we'll keep 75% if you sign that we co-discovered it. And the French said, excuse me, you did it with our virus. And Bush the Smarter said, yes, but we got the patent. So, could have been an accident. And they said, it's not right. We should get 75 and you should get 25. And Bush the Smarter said, would you like 0? Because that's what you're getting net. Either sign this and get 25% or get 0. It's fine with me, whichever one you do. The reason I'm telling you this is the American legal system. If you ever say, I am guilty, you can never take it back. In the American legal system, once you sign that piece of paper, it's done. The only thing that will reverse it is a presidential pardon, and even then, first of all, you won't get one, and secondly, it still won't come off being written. You can never reverse it if you admit. So if somebody says, I saw you beating your children, and the police come by and say, did you beat your children? You say, no, I didn't beat my children. They said, well, we're taking them to Health and Human Services unless you sign this paper and say you never did it again. Don't sign it if you didn't do it. You can never take it back in our legal system. And the French signed. So, when Clinton became president, they went back and said, we got screwed. And Clinton says, damn, you did get screwed. Whew, that must have hurt. And then he said, the French said, we should get 75 and you should get 25. And Clinton says, well, that sounds about right. And I'll give it to my Attorney General. And the Attorney General says, co means co. And so the most they can ever get is 50%. That's what co-discoverer means. You signed it. It can never be taken back. So you do a Google search. You look on the newspapers. It will say that Gallo and the French co-discovered it, even though the French published a paper in 1983 and Gallo didn't do it till 1985. In the history books, it will always say they co-discovered it. Only people that were there will know, that the Americans stole it from the French, and then they got screwed over by the patent law. So anyway, who discovered the disease?
Wow.
The disease.
French.
No, the disease.
Oh,
Gottlieb. Who discovered the microbe that causes the disease? Two people got the Nobel Prize. Montagnier and Barré-Sinousset is who got it. They got the Nobel Prize because everybody knows that they got robbed of it. But officially, who co-discovered it?
yeah.
Gallo and Montagnier. Gallo and Montagnier officially co-discovered it by treaty. But by reality, it's Montagnier and Barré-Sinousset. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, can you repeat? Who
Yeah.
who were the two people that won the Nobel
Okay.
Prize?
The people that won the Nobel Prize was Montagnier, Luc Montagnier, who was head of retrovirology at Institut Pasteur, and Barré-Sinousset, Barré-Sinousisse. It's in the notes, just look. Okay, Barré-Sinousset and Luc Montagnier got the 2007 Nobel Prize for the first discovery of LAV. All right, so we've gone through the history here, and so we'll just fly back just a little bit and go through the last little thing. You can see how many people in the world in 2008 were infected with the virus, and you'll notice that there is a huge number in sub-Saharan Africa, right now up to 60 million there, because that's where it came from. But why are there so many in Eastern Europe? Anybody have an idea of why so many in the former Soviet Union and the satellites of the Soviet Union?
Because they have the drug problems?
IV drug problem, and there was not a tradition in many Soviet hospitals and Eastern European hospitals of sterilizing needles. They reused needles. Plus, in Bulgaria, and the... No, it's... Which one had Ceausescu as dictator? Romania. In Romania, they have the most infected most infected of all of Europe is Romania. And the reason is that there was a tradition, remember under Ceausescu, he wanted more Romanians. And he outlawed birth control, the communist dictator of Romania. And so all of these, lots and lots of babies were born. And then when the babies were born, it was a tradition in that country to give them a transfusion of strong blood of the Romanian people, you know. And so they gave untested blood to babies. So there are orphanages in Romania right now with hundreds and hundreds of HIV-positive children in them from this mistake that was made because they didn't allow birth control and every baby got untested blood at birth. So they have huge numbers there. In the rest of Eastern Europe, it was IV drug use and reuse of non-sterile needles that was common during the Soviet times. All right, so the next controversy, it seems like the AIDS is always in controversy, and it is. The next controversy is, how did this disease get into man, and when did we stop calling it bread? So, by 1985, there was a blood test. Gallo had developed the blood test, and they were testing the blood, and they found, of course, that this disease was in it, and Fiorino had proven it was in the blood supply, and so they called a blood bank conference at the CDC. And the blood bank conference got together Red Cross and all the other blood banks, and Don Francis stood up and said, okay, the blood test is not approved yet. Remember, it hadn't come out yet. It's 1983, 1984. 1985 is when Gallo got the blood test. The blood test is not out, but we know it's in the blood supply because of Fiorino's tracing of the blood donors of baby victims. And he said, so my idea is this. Why don't we make everybody that donates blood give a statement or fill out forms? Anybody that has had multiple sexual partners anyone that has had a STD and anyone that is a sex worker, that's a nice way to put it. All of those people be asked to self-withhold. You know, like, remember when, what's his name, Romney was running out, they're going to self-exclude themselves, illegal aliens, you know, were going to leave the country, so they were going to immigrate or whatever it was. Well, he said all of these people, when they go to donate blood, let's just have a little checkbox and have them put on check if they've had multiple sexual partners in the last year, if they've had an STD in the last year, or if they're a sex worker, and then they can donate blood, but we will throw it away. Because you remember, lots of times there's a lot of pressure to donate blood. I remember we used to have things where we would have blood drives where the biology department would go against the chemistry department to see who could collect more blood from their students and teachers. And what if you know you're a ho-ho? You know, and here you are being pressured by your boss to beat the chemistry department by donating blood. You're going to go and donate blood even though you know you might be giving someone a disease. So this is called self-exclusion. So they go ahead and take the blood. They don't treat you like any different than anyone else. They still get your cookie and orange juice afterward. But there's a little checkbox on your paperwork that says, please throw this out because I meet one of these criteria. And what do you think the blood banks voted?
No.
No. It's the only place in the world where people give a product that the blood banks sell for $1,400. Remember, Red Cross, you may think they're wonderful. They have yet in the whole wide world ever give a unit of blood away. They never give blood, ever. You can donate for somebody. You can have your family donate for you. You can donate ahead of time, but you always gotta pay. The blood banks never give blood away. And they name another place in the world where you give them something they sell for such a huge amount of money. Nowhere. You think they're going to want to cut into their profits? No. They voted no. So then Don Francis said, since hepatitis B is transmitted exactly the same way, and we have a blood test for hepatitis B, why don't we require all blood that's donated be tested for hepatitis B? We'll get rid of hepatitis B carriers, and since it's the same method of transmission, we'll also get rid of most of the people that have this disease. How do you think they voted? No. It would increase the cost. In fact, the head of the Red Cross, the president of the Red Cross, wrote a memo to all the other blood banks, and it said, resist with all possible force the government imposition of required testing on the nation's blood supply. Our lawyers have told us it will cost us $24 million a year to test the blood versus the lawsuits we will lose will be about $12 million for infecting people.
That's ridiculous. So it's like human lives over money?
Please, it's America.
So
Money's
it's-
always first.
But how did they get away with it? You know,
No
this
one
is
cares.
the
They
US.
did until these memos came out and Congress passed a law requiring them to test for it. They did not do it until
I'm sure there's
Congress
stuff
in
now going on
When do
similar
they
to
make
this.
it?
1985. So anyway, the point is naming the disease. At this conference, there was a man, a scientist by the name of Bruce Bowler. Very important, it's a test question. Veller or Bowler, he prefers you call it Veller. I've always called it Bowler, never mind. Bruce Veller was a fellow, that's a very high-level scientist at the Rockefeller Institute of Research in New York City. He's also was the first head of the National Gay Task Force, and he was also head of the Mariposa Research Foundation for Retrovirology. And Bruce Bowler said, we are trying to trace the cause and the people that have passed on this disease. And I have a man in Salt Lake City who's 75 years old. And I went in and told him and his family he has gay-related immune deficiency disease, and they threw me out of the hospital. and I went to Miami, and I was talking to a Haitian woman and told her that her newborn baby had gay-related immune deficiency disease, and she asked me, how can my baby be gay? He said, the name of this disease is blocking research. It is misinforming people. It is a detriment to the research of this disease, and I propose we rename it Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. So Bruce Bowler, at the blood conference that accomplished nothing else, renamed the disease Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. And then Fiorino became famous because he traced baby AIDS and proved that the virus was in the blood supply. Gallo designed the blood test. All right, so the question then comes, the controversy next was, where did it originate? Because a lot of people got really upset when we said it came from monkeys. Because there's always everyone that starts thinking, well, people having dirty sex with monkeys. I mean, you know, only Americans, as the French says, only in America is sex dirty. If you think about it, it's true. We have that Protestant way of thinking about sex is that first we can't talk about it, but if we do talk about it, it's always dirty and it's sneaky and off to the side, and we can never talk bluntly about it. And yet in France at the beach they walk around with their boobs hanging out and everything else, and nobody thinks it's dirty. But here, oh my God! You know? So when they said that the variety of this disease called simian immunodeficiency virus that's found in large apes, it's called SIV, and they compared it to the genetics of ours, which at the time, remember, it's been called, what was it first called? The virus.
Grid.
No, the virus, that's the disease. You got to distinguish between the disease and the virus.
LAV?
LAV. All right, it was first called LAV. And then what was it called in America? HTLV3. All right, and then the University of California in San Francisco isolated their own, and they called it ARV, AIDS-related virus. And then the International Conference on Nomenclature said that both the Americans and the French had acted immorally and unethically, because remember, after the Americans stole it, both the French and the Americans sabotaged each other and lost like 1/3 of the research money by their little petty fights, that they took the naming away from both of them and they named it Human Immunodeficiency Virus. And later on we learned there's two, so this one is the one in this country is called type 1. It has never, here's a test question, it has never been called the AIDS virus. Only newspapers, because they're too stupid to explain it. You know, they don't want to explain that there's two stages of the disease. When you have the virus HIV and have no symptoms, you're in HIV disease. When you're in the last stages of HIV disease, you're in full-blown AIDS. They don't want to have to explain that. They think people are too stupid to understand. So in the newspaper they say, that man has the AIDS virus. It is not a legal term. It has never been a legal term. It is colloquialism. It has only legally been called these four things, and the legal one is human immunodeficiency virus, 3 words.
So after that it became AIDS, right?
Yes, after Bruce Bowler, GRID became AIDS. So the disease has been called GRID, and then AIDS, and then in Africa it's called Slim disease. All right, so when they looked at simian immunodeficiency virus and they looked at HIV, they are not close enough. They are both retroviruses, but they're not close enough for us to see that one came from the other. There are some differences, and it's disturbing because it's like 25% different. And so there was a big argument about, is it really a zoonosis from an African green monkey, or from an orangutan, or is it from a great ape, or is it from a chimpanzee, Or is it from something else? And remember, if you go anywhere in the world and you ask anybody on the street, except for maybe a scientist, where did this come from? What are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you this little story. And this was what they consider the greatest success of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. During the AIDS crisis, the embassies of the Soviet Union in East Africa gave a press release that said that the Americans were making a biological weapon at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and that this weapon got out of control, so they loaded it up on a plane and sprayed it over East Africa. And that's where AIDS came from. And everywhere in the world, which would you rather believe? A good little story like that or the real truth that's complicated? Most people believe the conspiracy theory. Everywhere in the world, if you ask them, they'll say, oh, it was an American weapon and it got out of control. Now, is that logical? Think about it. It's an enveloped virus, so all you have to do is mix it with 5% bleach or phenol or Lysol and you kill it. So how could it get out of control? And then two, this is 1985. Could we do recombinant then? No. We could move one gene and we still can't move more than a few. So we couldn't create a whole new virus. Plus, they can go back in historical samples and find the virus as far back as 1957 in bloods that were frozen back then. But people prefer to believe this. Now think about it. How many people would you have to kill after they loaded it up on a plane, flew it to Africa, and sprayed it out over Africa? Because you'd have to keep it quiet. Do you think one of those people would tell? Of course they'd tell. So you'd have to kill a lot of people to do that. And then think of it, where's that plane? And spraying it in the air, is that going to give it to somebody? No. So every part of the story is ludicrous, but people believe it. And it's the conspiracy theories. So anyway, the virus did come from AIDS, and this is called the Soviet Misinformation Campaign. And then a man by the name of Duesenberg is what White Job next door believes. And Duesenberg says that this is an environmental contaminant. HIV is a normal environmental contaminant that is harmless. And that what kills people is a bad lifestyle combining with drug use. That drug abuse plus repeated sexually transmitted diseases and a bad nutrition causes the destruction of an immune system, and that there is no need to use condoms because HIV doesn't cause this disease. It's just a normal environmental contaminant that a lot of people happen to have. And that if you do have HIV and you take the drugs, it's the drugs that are killing you, so you shouldn't take the drugs. And this guy is a Nobel Prize winner. His name is Duesenberg, and he's from the Bay Area, and he's all over. He's the most famous AIDS denialist. The funny thing is, he has his Nobel Prize in economics, not in science, not in real science. And every time he gives one of his speeches, in the Bay Area, Don Francis always does the same thing. He stands up in the question and answer and says, Dr. Duesenberg, if you really believe this, then why don't we inject you with HIV and watch and see what happens? Because you're telling people to stop taking their drugs, which will kill them. Why should they risk if you're not? At which point Duesenberg always storms off the stage. So remember, Duesenberg believes that this is that HIV is harmless and that you don't need to take precautions and that the drug companies are killing you. And then the next idea that came out was a man, and this one was really good, a man that said, well, you know, the first polio vaccine was made in rhesus monkey cells. And those were rhesus monkeys from East Africa. And what if the first polio vaccines that were given were contaminated with this virus, HIV? And so, while at the same time we were giving people their polio shots for a while, we were also infecting them. And that's how so many people got it so suddenly. Well, it's not a terribly wild idea, and it's easily provable or disprovable, because when you're doing research, you freeze back samples of every step of when you're making a vaccine. So they went and DNA probed all of these samples of the early vaccines, and they found no HIV. But here's something funny. They did find SV40. Simian virus 40 was in the first polio vaccine, and that's a cancer virus. Maybe that's why cancer suddenly became so much larger than it did. But anyway, there was no HIV in it. But it was a very, very good idea. It was by Hooper, and his book was The River, the Source of HIV. All right, so what is the evidence we have? We have a man in the Congo who died in 1959 of symptoms that were reported, remember we weren't there, to be the same as what we now call AIDS. And he was a rich guy, and so they took him immediately to England and treated him with everything they had, and he still died, but because the English had no idea what he died of, they froze back his tissues. And so once we had the virus, they did probes of it, and they found it was HIV-1. So we do know that he had it in 1959, long before we first saw the first one. Then my job, when I was at the CDC, is once we developed the blood test, my job was to go back and those miles and miles of liquid nitrogen samples of blood taken from every outbreak of every illness in the world since 1901, my job was to test every sample to see what the earliest samples we could get that had HIV in them. And what we found was there was one in 1905, and it was from a place in what we now call South Sudan. And then in 1976, there was an outbreak of Lassa fever in Nigeria. So we went and bled several thousand people there, and I went back and took those samples back out in 1985 and retested them, and we found 5% of them were positive. So we know it was circulating quietly, low level, in 1976. And there was one woman who was a prostitute from Kinshasa, and her designation was H3761976. And so I took her blood and I put it on white blood cells because it was so positive on the blood test. I just wanted to see if we could get a live virus. And we got it, and it was designated HZ321. That was her designation, 321, 1976. So this is the oldest live sample of HIV, and it was taken in 1976 from a lady that eventually died of AIDS, and she was a prostitute in Kinshasa, Zaire. So this is the oldest living sample that we have. This one we could probe his tissues and find it, but we couldn't get a living sample of it. So still, none of those match anything with a monkey. And so a man by the name of Hahn at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, he went and bled every wild animal he could get his hands on in all of East Africa. And then they went back and they looked to see if they had SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, which, by the way, doesn't kill monkeys quickly. The monkeys hardly ever die of SIV. They can pass it through sex and by fighting and getting all bloody, but they don't seem to die. If you take SIV and put it in a Filipino monkey, it will kill it in 3 days. Why? The African monkey evolved with it, and it's learned an accommodation. Filipino monkey has never seen it. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, what we discovered was he found a subspecies of chimpanzee in Cameroon that has exactly 98% the same as our HIV-1 that's spread all over the United States. So now there is conclusive proof, published in 2004 in Nature, that the virus that is the HIV-1 that spread all over the United States, was once it is a zoonosis from a subspecies of chimpanzee in the Cameroon. Now there are different varieties, and they adapt to how they're spread. And the one we have in this country, you'll love the name of it, BO. It's HIV-1BO. And the B stands for blood. It is much more easily spread blood to blood than sexual. And so, actually it's HIV-1MBO. And M is the one that spread worldwide, and that's most probably because of the, the buying of blood. And the one that we have is blood-to-blood better adapted. In other words, what we did was we looked at discordant couples. Anybody remember that? What's a discordant couple?
One that has it, one hasn't.
One has it, one doesn't. And remember, every hemophiliac in the United States that got blood products for hemophilia before 1986 is HIV positive. Why? The blood clotting product was made from hundreds of peoples of donated blood. The blood banks were told all you have to do is heat it, but that would cost an extra $3, so they didn't. So every hemophiliac that got blood clotting factor before 1985, when Congress made them, has HIV. And so these men, many of them are married. And so we went to look at how many of their wives picked it up from them. And what we discovered was, even before they knew it, not many of the wives got it immediately. Most people think, if you have sex, unprotected sex with one person, you're going to get it. Well, with my luck, it'd probably be true. But in most of the cases, it takes 5 exposures. 5 exposures. And of course, the person has to have a high viral load. So in these women, we discovered that using a diaphragm, using non-oxal 9 as a spermicide, and different things like that seemed to interrupt it, and it wasn't perfectly transmitted by sex. However, just a wet needle will it perfectly transmit it. So, that just happens to be the strain in the United States is not perfectly transmitted by sex, which then leads us to the next question. What strain is? And if there is a strain that is in Thailand that is perfectly transmitted. And this one, anybody do the reading about it yet? Okay. Well, first of all, not today, but let's say 10 years ago, what's the #1 export of Thailand? No one will know. Sex. Yes. Thailand was famous for having sex vacations. Yeah. Sex vacations. And Europeans would go there, and you could like call up ahead and say, I'd like an 11-year-old girl or a 9-year-old boy, and you could order what you want. And then you would come for your sex vacation. And prostitution is legal there. And so in the sex economy of Thailand, there developed a strain of HIV that is perfectly transmitted by one heterosexual act. And it's called HIV-1E. So, on the test, I'm going to ask you, which one developed in the brothels of Thailand? And it is 100% one sex act, one unprotected sex act. We'll get it? And it's HIV-1E. So, anyway, let's see if there's anything. We already talked about why it spread around the world and all of that. So we've gotten past this and this. Let's talk about HIV #2. All right, so once the French had worked on HIV-1, which they named LAV, they went to their former colonies in West Africa and were trying to find out how many people were infected. And so when they got to their former colonies and they were using these HIV-1 tests, they found people that had symptoms of AIDS but tested negative on the HIV-1 blood test. And so a lady by the name of Brune Vizinet at the Institut Pasteur decided to see if she could isolate another strain of HIV. And she did, and she named it HIV number 2. Now, if you want to get tested for HIV number 2, you can't go to the free testing center. Like if you go to Out of the Closet, don't go to our college, they're really awful. But if you go to any of the other places that are supposed to give you free tests, they will be running an HIV-1 test on you. And the reason is, we have the patent for that. Do you think the French gave us permission to use HIV number 2? Do you think they gave us a sample? No, they didn't make the same mistake twice. So if you want to get an HIV-2 test, you have to either check into the hospital, because everyone in the United States, whenever you get admitted to a hospital, you know that 20-page admission form you signed with you know, they made 400 copies of the same paper so you could hardly read the little, you give your permission to be tested for HIV-1 and 2 anonymously. Yeah?
Do we have HIV-2?
What?
What's the percent of incidence here
Where?
in LA?
Or United
Nobody.
States.
Nobody?
There is no HIV-2 in the United States or Canada. And we'll talk about why in just a second. And that's why we're not really upset if you go get tested and they're not testing you for HIV-2, because there is none in this country. Only in the United States and Canada is there no HIV-2. Anyway, and the reason for that is right after we came out with the HIV-1 blood test, they instituted what I was just about to tell you about, the Hospital Sentinel Prevention Program. You know what a sentinel, that is?
No.
It's a person who stands watch for the enemy to attack. You know, someone standing there with their gun, look out. That's a sentinel. Anyway, so the law is this. Every time anyone is admitted to a hospital in the United States, you are anonymously tested for both HIV-1 and HIV-2. Should you turn positive for 2, they will immediately contact Atlanta. Atlanta will send someone here to find out how you got it, who you got it from, and tell you that you're basically going to be watched. And please don't donate blood, don't have unprotected sex with people. And so the number of people that actually have it in the United States is well under 1,000. The only people that have ever gotten it in this country are people who had sex or were married or in East Africa or in Mexico or South America, because it's 1/3 of the cases everywhere else in the world are HIV-2. And some Angolan immigrants that immigrated here during the Angolan Civil War to Massachusetts that were fishermen, they brought it. But basically, there is no HIV number 2 in this country. If you want to get tested for it, however, you have to go to a private doctor. If you go to a private doctor, all of them use the Institut Pasteur kit, which tests you for both 1 and 2 at the same time. And so the problem is you don't want to go to a private doctor. You see, you do not want to get what they call, you want anonymous testing, not confidential testing. Does anybody know the difference between anonymous and confidential? Confidential means you know, the doctor knows, the doctor's office knows, the nurses know, but your records are private unless opened by a court. So basically you and only 10,000 other people know. And anonymous means no one knows but you, because you're given a secret number, and that number is never associated with your name. So if you go for anonymous testing, no one knows. And why do we care? Well, until next year, we care. When the Obama healthcare thing kicks in completely, then they cannot deny you insurance. But right now, they can deny you. But if we took 2 samples from the same person, it would not. It would be almost identical. So, they called up Gallo and said, Don Francis says, could you send me a sample of your virus? And Gallo said, are you crazy? I'm trying to save the world. Didn't you hear me on television? Every smidgen of it's got to be used to find the blood test to save the world. Quit bothering me with your petty little problems. And he hung up on him. So Don Francis called the Surgeon General of the United States, C. Everett Koop. Now, the Surgeon General is called the Surgeon General, but he's the general of nothing. He is a spokesman for the American government on health issues. He is given a uniform of a Navy general, but he has no guns or no troops. The only person he can order around is his secretary. But he does have a lot of prestige because, you know, that's his job, to speak for the American government on health issues and to recommend things to the American people. And so Francis calls Koop and says, Gallo, just like little children, Gallo won't give us the virus. And Koop says, yes, he will. And Don Francis says, no, he won't. And Koop says, call me back tomorrow, because he will. So Koop calls Gallo and says, give Don Francis the virus, because you're not going to be able to prove that your virus causes this disease because you need 3,000 bloods, and the only place in the world where they have them is the CDC. So if you want to prove that this virus causes that disease, you're going to need his bloods and his cooperation, which means you're going to have to give him the virus. And Gallo said, no. And Koop says, yes. Gallo said, make me. You don't control my money. And Koop says, yes, but I can call a press conference and say one head of a laboratory in the United States is failing to cooperate with another and is endangering the American people. So I would like for you to have it to Dr. Francis by next week. Gallo hangs up on him. So we wait, because this disease is now in the blood supply. And I will be spending every moment of every day to develop a blood test. And then I will have a blood test in 6 months, and I'll have a vaccine in a year. Thank you, my name is Robert Gallo. And so, remember, he had mentioned that Fiorino, which now is known as the father of baby AIDS, because we changed the name of the disease to AIDS, Paul Fiorino had been looking at babies that had symptoms of GRID, and he had discovered that one of them had received a blood donation from a guy who had died of GRID. And so he was trying to trace all of them, but the Red Cross said no. He went to the Red Cross and said, these babies are dying of GRID. Who gave them the blood transfusions? Where did they come from? And the Red Cross said, privacy. And the guy, and Fiorino says, you realize the entire United States is in danger if you don't allow me to prove this. And they said, and if you do, we won't get free donations of blood. So no, we're not telling you. If it hadn't been for a technician in the Red Cross who went in there and took a floppy, remember those? And copied all the names of the donors and gave it to the government, we wouldn't know. So anyway, Fiorino proved that it was already in the blood supply, and Gallo announced that he was going to have a blood test. Well, the French were going, huh? Don't you guys at the CDC have all these bloods proving that it's LAB? And Gallo didn't mention LAB or anything. And so Montagnier calls Don Francis and he says, Don, do you think that Gallo stole our virus? And Francis says, absolutely not. Maybe he isolated something similar from other people. And Montagnier said, well, you know, the only way to prove that is to get a sample of this virus and run the genetics. Because if I had this disease and I had sex with her and gave it to her, it would change by 5%. This retrovirologist on Earth, I would not have missed it. And of course, you know how the French and Americans are. You know, they were the first people to come in our revolution and help us, yet how well do we get along with the French? Not well at all. You know why? Why do we not get along with the French well? We're just alike. We both are arrogant people who think we have the answer for the rest of all of the world. We know the way to do it. And if you do it our way, it'll be fine. Well, that's what they think. And so we have never, you know, it's like two kids with the same personality. They do not get along. So, when Gallo is reaming Montagnier tells him, shove it. And he storms off the stage and he says, I withdraw my paper. And he storms out the hall, and just before he leaves the room, Gallo goes back to the podium and says, stop! We can't act like children. This is a world crisis. We have to work together. I don't believe you have discovered anything. However, you have some evidence that needs to be checked out. I will send my very best student with you back to Paris to clean up that nasty hellhole of a lab you've got with all the contamination. And I will have them check your procedures, which I know are false. And you leave your virus and your photograph of it here, and I'll take it to my lab and we'll check it out. However, I know it's crap. However, you could have something. And so we will work together, and every Friday we'll have a conference call and update each other on their research. And Montagnier thought, oh, this is wonderful. The greatest retrovirologist on earth is going to confirm my discovery. And so he does it, and he waits. No Friday calls ever come in. Nothing comes in. So back at the CDC, we are running ELISAs on all 3,000 bloods, and they're coming out 98% positive. So we then run another test that's even better than ELISA called radioimmune precipitation test, where you radioactively label the virus. So we did. So of course he was absolutely ecstatic when he found this out, and then we said, you know, read us the codes, and they hit it 100%. Why am I telling you this? Because he puts together a paper to give at the International Conference on Retrovirology at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, December 1982. So in December 1982, Montagnier goes to New York to give a paper at Gallo's big convention of all retrovirology people. And being the way Gallo is, since Montagnier had no relationship with him and was not a student or a friend, he put him last on the program. And all the previous papers were about other retroviruses or how Gallo's virus was in AIDS patients 1% of the time. And they could never get more than 1%. They were convinced that you get HTLV1 and then you use drugs and it destroys your immune system. But they never got more than 1% of the GRID patients being positive for HTLV1. And he was getting very frustrated. He was convinced it was his virus that causes the disease. So when Montagnier gets up and gives this speech about LAV, the entire room goes suddenly silent. Everyone's in complete shock. And Gallo goes to the microphone and reams them anew. Are you crazy? Are you insane? I discovered human retrovirology. Do you think the best laboratory in the world, with the best equipment, with the most smart people in the whole world, would miss a human retrovirus? My lab. First of all, Barry Sensei, who was one of my students, was a C student. She's not smart. That lab you have over in Paris is a piece of crap. It's full of contaminants. This is an environmental contaminant you have misidentified. You're idiots. I could not have missed it. I am the greatest. When the antibody sticks to it and you wash it off, you can read it with radioactivity. And it comes out 99.8% positive to LAV. And we are putting together this omnibus paper to submit to the journals. When we get a telephone call, turn on the television. There's about to be an announcement from Washington. Turn on the television, and there it comes on. I'll never forget it. We interrupt As the World Turns to bring you the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler. Now, Margaret Heckler, she's a nice lady, but she's dumb. She's a real estate agent. She was Secretary of Health and Human Services because she donated a lot of money to Ronald Reagan, and they needed a woman in the cabinet. So he made her Secretary of Health. She knew nothing about science. So she comes on and she says, the eminent Dr. Gallo, who of the National Cancer Institute, who was the discoverer of the first human cancer virus, announced today he has discovered the causative agent of GRID. And I don't understand everything he's about to say, so I'm going to have Dr. Gallo present this to you. So Gallo comes up and he says, I've discovered a novel new human retrovirus in the same family as my other two. You do remember I discovered the very first two, not one, two human retroviruses. And I've named my new one after my other two. And I've named it HTLD3, which you'll see on the thing back there. By the way, it doesn't, the letters are the same, but it doesn't stand for lymphotrophic, it stands for lymphocytic, which means killer. It's human lymphocytic virus type 3. And he said, it's in the same family as my previous discoveries, and I isolated from people with symptoms of this, and that it is another scientist at the Centers for Disease Control by the name of Paul Fiorino has, by tracing baby GRID, babies that have GRID, has proven that this is in the nation's blood supply. So we are in critical shape.